Welcome. My name is Lloyd Borrell. Today, I'm thrilled to have as my guest Dr. Paul Héroux. Dr. Héroux is Occupational Health Program Director at the Department of Epidemiology, Biostatistics and Occupational Health at McGill University and Medical Scientist at the Department of Surgery at McGill University Health Center. He's the author of numerous research papers on electromagnetic fields and health stretching back over 4 decades. Dr. Paul Héroux, welcome to the EMF Health Summit.
Hello.
It's great to have you on. Now, you've been working in this field for a long time. You published research on EMFs going back to the 1970s. Actually, went through your CV a little while ago, which is 17 pages long. It's very impressive. How did you first become involved in the study of EMFs and health?
Well, historically, as you probably know, one of the first indications that electromagnetic fields could induce public health effects came from Nancy Wertheimer in Colorado. She was an epidemiologist, and she happened to be married to Ed Leeper, who was an electrical engineer. And when she found connections between the number of wires around homes and the incidence of leukemia in children, apparently they must have had a husband discussion, and she published a paper saying maybe there is a link with magnetic field exposure and leukemia. And for many years, for about 5 years, not much happened as a result of this publication. But afterwards, it sort of caught on. And at that time, I was doing research for a power utility, Hydro-Québec, here in Canada. And I was at the same time following courses in biology and even some courses in medicine, because my employer, Hydro-Québec, is very broad-minded, wants to expand the scope of its employees. So I was in a great position to assess what this meant. And over time and through the work of other pioneers, I became convinced that this was a very, very important question. And essentially, over time, starting from my physics and engineering experiences, I developed expertise in biology and in medicine, and I sort of collected all this information together to gain a perspective about this problem. And one of the difficulties that we have in dealing with such a situation is that usually you have people who know one aspect of the problem, like industry knows the engineering aspect, but tries to, so to speak, handle or, in a sense, attenuate the influence of the biological point of view in such questions. So at a certain point, I was at McGill. I transferred from the utility to McGill, and I did with Ying Li some critical experiments that sort of scandalized me. While I was in the utility, I prepared to do tests on this hypothesis that electromagnetic fields could influence, say, cancer cells. And I thought this would be a very, very subtle thing to detect. To my surprise, it was incredibly easy to detect. In other words, if you don't see these effects, there's something wrong with you as a scientist. So then the question was, how come something that is entirely obvious can remain below the radar for so long? And essentially, since I have performed these tests in my lab, and since measuring the relative, I would say, blindness of our society to this problem, unfortunately, I am a victim of this situation. I can't let this go because this is something that's too important. People have to know about it, and we have to solve this problem. And I think technically, with good engineering, we can solve this problem. So I feel a little bit like a victim, frankly, because I could have chosen any scientific field I wanted, but instead that field chose me.
So you made reference there. Well, it's fascinating what you were saying there. You made reference to the Wertheimer-Leeper study, this study back in the 1970s, which is essentially about magnetic fields, of course. So perhaps you could start out just by clarifying for people that are new to this, that are trying to understand this, what magnetic fields are and why it's important that we talk about them here today.
Okay, the most important point about this issue of magnetic fields or electric fields or electromagnetic fields, it's very important to understand that in an engineering view, people tend to divide frequencies by application and to say that there's low frequencies, there's radio frequencies, microwave frequencies, there's the frequencies of microwave, there's the frequencies of cellular phone systems. In an engineering view, because engineering uses selectivity to, I would say, gather specific signals and exclude others, there is a notion that all of these applications should be considered separately. But in fact, all non-natural electromagnetic fields share not only a potential, but a decisive, I would say, property to affect biological systems. So although the work that I did was on ELF magnetic fields, which are 50 or 60 hertz in the world, when you use a cell phone, a GSM cell phone, for example, although the carrier might be at 1 or 2 gigahertz or 2.5 gigahertz, the modulation has components at low frequencies, for example, 217 hertz. And when you hold the cell phone near to your head, coupling to your head is primarily through the magnetic field. So wherever the carrier goes, these low frequency components go as well. So when I'm doing research on 60 hertz, I tested a variety of frequencies, still relatively low, but these experiments are totally relevant to the whole of the telecommunications debate. So from the point of view of industry, it's very advantageous to divide everything in small pieces. You know, it's called salami slicing. So in each piece of salami, there's never enough evidence to indict a biological effect if you make the slices thin enough. But overall, these fields are all biologically active and should be handled, should be engineered in such a way that they don't injure people. So these early experiments have wide applicability to the problem at hand, which is how do we protect ourselves against electromagnetic fields while ensuring that we can use them technically for technological development.
Mm. And I guess the question that begs is, you know, let me play devil's advocate, is, you know, are they dangerous? Are they really dangerous? Do we need to protect ourselves? And, you know, I know you've done so many studies on this. And one study, because we've talked a lot about Dr. Martin Paul's work during this summit, different speakers have. And it's nice that we're here talking about your work, which in my view is you know, equally important. It's certainly not less important. I mean, it's not as if we're comparing apples and pears, because it's quite different. But you're both studying the effects of these electromagnetic fields on the body, and as you say, this analysis that we have, this way of understanding it, you know, calling it magnetic fields, electric fields, and radio frequency radiation, and dirty electricity, and all these other terms, they are just kind of just a means for us to understand it, and a kind of a false division. It's not. It doesn't really. You know, it's just a way to understand it, nothing more. But if you could talk about, the danger aspect, so that people can get this. For instance, the way that EMFs impact water. I know you did a study on that. It's very interesting because we are primarily composed of water. We're not about 70-80% water. And I know you did a very interesting study on that and how it impacted our cells and the ATP in our cells. Could you just talk to that a moment, please?
Yes. What is very surprising is that after the 1979, study by Wertheimer, scientists all over the world began to ask the question, is there an effect of magnetic fields on biological systems? And a few years later, the Russians, Samykhina and Kiselev at Lomonosov Institute in Moscow, had found the answer. They documented that very small levels of magnetic fields could affect the structure of water. And of course, if you don't know the consequences of this, and if you don't know the structure of the enzyme ATP synthase, you might think that this is a footmark in the annals of science. But actually, changing the structure of water has deep consequences. And what I feel is that the electromagnetic field effects that I've documented act at such a basic level that it's extraordinarily worrisome. In other words, it's not like it acts on a specific protein and that only this protein will be affected. It acts on a very fundamental tissue, which is water. Water channels are ubiquitous in biological systems. And what they documented is that because of a phenomenon called tunneling, the motion of electrons and protons in biological systems will be affected by any type of non-natural electromagnetic field because physiological systems are not designed to tolerate and handle them. So you're talking about an effect that is so fundamental that the downstream consequences of this could be enormous. And in terms of health effects, which is your question, what you have to realize is that over the last 100 years, we have lived with diseases that are like Parkinson's, like Alzheimer's disease, diabetes, cancer. And we've seen the rise in the incidence of these things increase. This has been rising all the time. And conventional public health doesn't have many good explanations, nor does it have good explanations for the fact that fertility is going down. So there is, in my opinion, a very good case to be made for the fact that a lot of the diseases that we take for granted in our society are influenced by these fields and by the progressive increase in the richness, so to speak, of our electromagnetic environment. That being said, I don't think that all cancers are caused by electromagnetic fields. But if electromagnetic fields, as they are in our environment right now, cause only 10% of all of these diseases, the consequences on us are enormous. And the consequences are more enormous in the sense that we could handle the situation in a way that these effects are eliminated and that these victims become healthy and that our public healthcare system is liberated from a supplementary load. So I think that they're engineering solutions and that we should act to implement them.
Yeah, we're going to talk about solutions. I'm glad you've mentioned that. We're going to talk about solutions later on. It's super important, obviously. And yeah, it is fundamental what you're saying here. And I like this terminology you've used there, the richness of these EMFs. And it's as if the richness of these EMFs are actually working to make us poorer in so many different respects. Most importantly, in terms of our health. But obviously, if they are going to impact our health on an individual level, then impact it on a society level, and therefore they impact us in every way, economically, just in every way unimaginable.
Well, something that's very important is that a lot of engineers believe that, if this electromagnetic environment is nefarious, all we have to do is turn the switch off and everything will be fine. But what engineers uniformly don't understand is that biology doesn't work this way. And one of the things that is practically never said, I think I'm the only one saying this, is that you expose yourself to electromagnetic radiation long enough and you are going to change the genetic destiny of the human race, probably in a negative way. Why is it in a negative way? It is because biology has depended on ATP and the supply of ATP for evolution for the last 2 billion years. This is truly the basis of evolution and of biological success. You impair this mechanism. And Nick Lane, from London, who recently won prizes in biochemistry, says, tamper with this mechanism at your own risk. And what we know about the mechanism of mitonuclear incompatibility, which can happen as a result of this electromagnetic environment that we have now, is that these alterations can happen and be irreversible. In other words, if we continue to expose ourselves chronically to this agent, we may change our genetic structure, in particular at the mitochondrial level. And when we try to undo this, it will be impossible to do it. So I think this is, as strong an indictment of a situation, leading us to be extraordinarily careful. And with 5G, we're living exactly the opposite. In other words, as Tom Wheeler from the FCC says, it's a lot better to let these innovators loose and fill the surface of the earth with 6 meter deep of microprocessors, thereby smothering the human race out of oblivion, than to risk losing a profit.
I'm not sure we all agree with that. Great impression there, by the way. And then, of course, it's not to say that there aren't safety guidelines. Let's just go down that avenue if we can for a sec here. Because there are safety guidelines, and of course there's safety guidelines in all walks of life, so why wouldn't there be safety guidelines with electromagnetic fields? And these safety guidelines are set by people like ICNIRP, this Commission for Non-Ionizing Radiation, by the IEEE, the engineering organisation, principally by these two bodies, as I understand it. And
no, but those are haute cuisine organizations. They're concerned with heat. So those are cooks. They're not safety organizations.
So let me just give you some figures here, okay? And you'll give me some comments on this, if you would, please. So the ICNIRP, which is the most stringent, they're saying and we're just talking, I'm just giving one instance here, okay, magnetic fields, so people can get an understanding of just, how big the gulf is. The ICNIRP are talking about an exposure limit of 2,000 milligauss for the general public. The Bioinitiative report, they recommend an upper limit of 1 milligauss for habitable space. Now, you've done a lot of research on this. What do you say to that? I mean, already 2,000 milligauss, 1 milligauss, but, what does your research say about, where the biological effects are happening? Is it the 2,000 milligauss one, or is it the 1 milligauss level?
1 milligauss, unfortunately, is too high, in the sense that we see important reactions in cancer cells at levels that are lower than 1 milligauss. 5 times lower than 1 milligauss is of concern. And so I have enough knowledge of engineering to realize that if you're going to reduce these AC fields in the environment to very, very low levels, you're not going to be able to do this with the current system of AC power. So what this means is that we should go to a DC power system. We already have experience with DC power systems. It's just that we have a tradition of using AC because of this wonderful device called a transformer, which allows us to change voltage levels. But for about 20 years now, we've had power semiconductors that would allow us to change DC power levels. And a DC electrical network would have a lot of advantages from the point of view of engineering. Of course, when you propose this to utilities, they have a big laugh because they say, well, we can keep all our lines, but we need to change all of our equipment. And that's true. And obviously, going to a DC power network, it's not something that can be done overnight. And I'm not requesting that. What I'm saying is that we should accelerate the migration, which is already occurring, by the way, towards a fully DC power network. And perhaps in 50 or 100 years, this is what we will have. But we should really go in that direction. Already there's motives for industry to go in that direction for high power, long power lines, and for computer systems which need DC, not AC. In fact, AC is not a necessity. It's just a byproduct of the fact that we only had transformers as a means of transforming power in the past. So as far as electrical power is concerned, we should go to DC systems.
And I'd like to talk about that in a second, if I may. But before we go there, I'd just like to go back to what you said before about the adverse biological effects. And you said to me it's something like 5 times lower than 1 milligauss. So just done some quick calculation there. Between the 2000 milligauss, which is the official recommendation, and what you're saying here, adverse biological effects, about 0.2 milligauss, okay? That means there's a 10,000-fold gulf between these figures. Are you in agreement with that, in that region?
Yes, I am in agreement with that. And we're not used to this kind of thing because most toxicology in the modern world has been done on chemicals. And chemicals usually produce effects or no effects within a much narrower range of exposures. But in other physical agents like sound, for example, it takes a large increase in I would say, in intensity to, for example, lose your hearing compared to the threshold of hearing. And of course, the same is true in electromagnetic fields. Before you heat up something, there is a huge increase that is necessary from the lowest important biological effect that we can find. And I don't like to see cancer cells change their behavior as a result of magnetic field exposures. And I think we should avoid that completely. And I don't think we can do this overnight. But engineering is extraordinarily flexible. Engineers are very smart in their field. They will give us what we need as a species to continue, enjoying the health that is the heritage of evolution.
Yes, totally agree. And I love your optimism also, by the way, because this is such a serious subject. And there are, and it's true that when you start learning about this and reading, and even people who often people who first learn about it, that's one of the things is they get kind of overwhelmed with the whole, the darkness of it, because it seems as though there are no solutions, but there are lots of solutions, not necessarily easy, but worthwhile, certainly. And
but not only worthwhile, but they will pay off, because a DC system would actually be something that would be more effective and less costly in the long run with the technical means we have to implement it at the moment. We are in a historical time warp, so to speak. We've deployed a particular power system, and it takes incredible imagination and will to want to change it. But it can be done, and the DC system, as proposed by Edison, essentially, would be a better solution. And probably engineers know this, but they understand the work that is involved in the change, so they will resist it. In other words, it's not on my watch. We'll do it in 10 years when somebody else is involved.
Yeah. So let's just explore that a little bit then, if we can. DC, direct current, because what was adopted worldwide pretty much is AC, alternating current, which, because there was a DC in the AC when this was being first introduced in the 19th century, and it was Tesla's, as I understand it, Tesla's system, AC system that won the day. And so you're saying that DC, direct current, is the way to go. So can you explain to us, why it's safer? What research we have on that? Why it's safer?
Okay. On the Earth, you have a field of 50 microtesla. a static field. In other words, this natural field of the Earth is something that biology has evolved within forever. So as long as you don't outrageously increase these fields or outrageously eliminate them, you will be in a zone that is very likely to be compatible with biology. For example, the magnetic field is stronger at the pole than it is at the equators. There's natural variations. Whenever you come an object that is made of iron, there's natural variations in the static magnetic field. So we know that this was part of the environment for a very, very, very long time, whereas these AC magnetic fields are extremely new, and the cell simply doesn't know how to handle them. And the reason why Edison lost the war against Tesla and Westinghouse is that he couldn't reach far with his wires at the voltage levels that he considered safe. He needed to increase the voltage levels to use smaller wires, but he had no means of doing so. Now we have thyristors, we have power transistors, we have a lot of devices that they're entirely capable of doing these transformations. They're used to link networks, power networks of adjoining, say, adjacent provinces or states together to eliminate the problem of stability. Because when two networks are connected, they need to be stabilized, synchronized together. So DC links eliminate this problem completely. So power utilities know how to do it. They want to have DC lines. They are more efficient because they function at maximum voltage and current continuously, whereas an AC system always has moments when it's doing absolutely nothing. So it is a solution that is technically very attractive. It's just that it's not our tradition. We would need to accept change. And change in the engineering community is not always welcome.
So this technology, because DC in our homes exists already, of course, because most of our electrical devices already run on DC, our computers and TVs and so on, they're already on DC, so I get that. But what you're saying is that the utilities are already transmitting DC over long distances, and they already know how to do this. That's what you're saying.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And if you had a DC power grid, any technical contribution from what you have in your home or the lines going to the street would be small compared to the static magnetic field of the Earth. In other words, it would be a small perturbation on something that already has existed for a long time, that we are already tolerant to. For example, the field at the right of way of many power lines is about 1 microtesla. If this line becomes a DC line, you'll get a field of approximately 1 microtesla, which is only 2% of the static field of the Earth. It's negligible, it's small. So instead of having something that sticks out enormously as an AC field, you would have something that would be lost in the natural noise of a static field environment that we're already equipped to handle.
And so, unfortunately, that's not for today. Really, it's more. It's a long-term view, and because obviously, I think we have to. As a society, we've got a lot to learn on this, and unfortunately, we're learning the hard way, are we not? And we're learning because we do have the science, and the science is pretty clear. And yet we're not listening to the science, and people are falling sick. And at the same time, we do not have the definitive proof. But it's really, there is so much evidence. The evidence is overwhelming. So this is...
Hey, you're saying we don't have definitive proof? You have a president in the United States that has talked about fake news? Fake science.
Yeah.
So there's more than one version of science. There is science done by scientists who are looking for answers. And then there is the science that utilities want you to know about. And the science of utilities tells you it's non-ionizing. Don't worry about it. So if you can accept a version of science that is so primitive and so obviously biased, I have something else to offer you. Bacteria and viruses can't harm you. They're much too small. They're much too small. So if you have simplistic thinking, you can arrange the future the way you want. Unfortunately, it's not true that the science is not definitive. The science is definitive. It's just that some people want to, I would say, popularize their version of science, which is fake science, because they don't want to see reality. How did Al Gore call this? He called this an inconvenient truth, didn't he? Well, maybe there's more than one of these truths lying around or closets.
Yeah, and certainly that applies to EMFs. An inconvenient truth, a real thorn in the side, but one that we have to address, and that's why it's important that we talk about it, and that's why I'm very happy to have you here today, and you're obviously very plain speaking about this, and I guess you've got nothing to lose here. You've got a you're an eminent scientist. You've got a long career behind you, and you're pretty, you know what you're talking about.
Yes, I feel that way. And as you say, I will not lose a grant, because of what I'm saying. And you should value the contribution of scientists at the end of their career, because at the end of their career, usually they are exactly in this position in which they don't fear the consequences of the powers that be in relation to their presentation or their statements. They tell it like it is. And so I think that I know this epidemiologist, Tony Miller, from the University of Toronto, who's very, very vocal about this risk. And having been retired recently, he's not going to lose a grant because of what he's saying. So these voices, I think, are important. And as well, we have to realize that whatever changes we make in our society has to respect feasibility and financial coherence. We can't spend huge amounts of money on problems while we have other problems to take care of. But blocking progress in this area because of narrow-mindedness by some segments of I would say, of engineering is just unacceptable. And who are the ones that will get the ball rolling? Is it the attorney generals who will take the initiative? Is it the politicians? Or is it public revolt? Is it maybe your website that will turn on the machine?
Who cares, as long as the machine gets turned on? That's the most important thing. But I know, so let's talk about 5G and the Internet of Things, if we can. Because I know you've been to Washington. So again, it was all on your 17 pages of CV with all your studies. And so I know you've been to Washington to meet the House of Representatives and the Senate. So could you just start very simply, because again, these are terms which are getting thrown around. We've had quite a few guests on who've talked about 5G, but not particularly Internet of Things. But could you just explain to us, by explaining what that is to start with?
5G. Well, 5G is the natural evolution. And then when I say natural evolution, I mean natural in terms of technical requirements, because all of these generations of cellular systems are improvements one over the other in terms of data transmission capabilities. In other words, they're all good engineering ideas that improve data throughput. What is a little bit more troubling is the concept of the Internet of Things. Everybody probably almost in the world, has a computer with an IP address. So the market in this way is saturated. How are we to sell more of these devices? Because, as you know, our capacity to produce things or capacity to produce, I would say, greenhouse gases or plastics that end up in the ocean is almost unlimited. How are we to produce more microprocessors? Well, let's make sure that every object we sell has a radio frequency emitter and receiver in it so that it can have its own IP address. So let's expand the capabilities of the system to the point where when you buy a tie, it will have a microprocessor in it. And it will tell the other ties in your cupboard that it's there. And when it wears out, it will send you an alarm through your computer to tell you that you have to replace it. So this is an engineering vision of every blade of grass being connected to every other blade of grass. This maximizes the sale of devices. I'm not sure that it does very, very much for us. You have a computer, you have Internet Protocol version 4, right?
I have a computer, yes.
And there's an Internet Protocol version 6, right?
Good question.
Version 6 has many, many, many more IP addresses. Now, if you take a cell phone and you give it an IP address, and you were going to give a large number of cell phones all the addresses that are included in Internet Protocol version 6, which is already in your computer, how much volume do you think that would take?
You tell me.
It would fill the volume between the orbit of the Earth and the orbit of Mars. In other words, there wouldn't be enough material on the planet to fulfill that dream. So when you're in a computer, it's very easy to have outlandish dreams of what the future will be. And it's very easy to forget about people. You're programming something. So this is the problem that the engineering views that they are proposing. And essentially, when you look at the amount of publicity that is done around 5G and Internet of Things, those are all dreams that are put forward and promoted by an industry that wants to sell more. We don't have to accept these dreams. We can transform them into, I would say, economic catastrophes or failed dreams, all to the better, of the human race, because they do clash directly with biology. So the Internet of Things is about making every object connected to every object. And the unfortunate aspect of this, I have no objection against connectivity. It's needed in power system, it's needed in telecommunications. But when you saturate the environment with electromagnetic radiation to the limit of cooking, it doesn't make any sense. In other words, data transmission is wonderful through an optical fiber. As wireless, it should only be used sparingly at low levels and when necessary, because we are not tolerant to that stuff.
So it's as if, because you're saying the engineers are wonderful, and I agree with you on that, and because I love gadgets, like most people nowadays, they've got a cell phone. I don't have a cell phone, but I love, that's for other reasons, but I love gadgets. And so the engineers are doing what engineers do, and they're doing it well in a sense, but the problem is we're not looking at the health consequences of what they're doing. Is that it in a nutshell?
Yes, and also the engineers have been told that there are no health consequences to what they're doing. So in other words, they're designing on the wrong assumption that electromagnetic fields don't do anything below the thermal level. So this is something that is I would say, an arrangement that was, I would say, concocted, what word should I use, cooked up by the by the electrical engineers so that they would have their hands free in designing and putting on the market whatever they wanted. And the sad thing is that you mentioned I went to Washington. I cooperate with Kevin Motis of the California Brain Tumor Association. And what has become plain to me is that industry is effective at having all this future that we dream about of saturating our lives with electromagnetic radiation, having this accepted by convincing legislators who are so challenged by all sorts of things that they cannot hope to go to the bottom of this problem, but by presenting a chromed and bright vision of the future, they give the impression that this future is inevitable, that their engineering solution that they have right now is the only solution possible. Otherwise, we will go back to living in caves, which is a basic engineering lie. In other words, they're making no representation for the fact that there are alternative solutions. You don't need to saturate the environment with electromagnetic radiation to have self-driving cars. You drive a car by looking around you. A self-driving car can do exactly the same thing with LiDAR or with a camera. You don't have to accept inferior techniques that are rushed into the market simply because a company wants to be first right now. The cost of that is exposure, overexposure of the whole population. That's not acceptable. So the problem with engineers is that they have been told by this standard that they invented themselves to be unhindered in commercialization, that there are no effects. Don't worry about them. This is a basic lie that was organized consciously, not with the intent of harming, but with the intent of selling as much junk as possible. And this is one aspect of what you could call a crime. The second aspect is that by limiting the thinking of the U.S. government in this way, by the FCC saying there's nothing below thermal, they have paralyzed the ability of U.S. science to look into this problem and to understand electromagnetic fields, thereby cutting us off from a future of medical advances, because these fields can be used to help, cure cancer, cure neurological diseases, and we have to know about these things. But the engineering have, so to speak, taken the lead in giving the impression that this does not exist, that it's not possible to use them for positive aspects or anything like that. So this is the second aspect, I think, that could be called a crime.
Yeah, and that's interesting what you're saying there, and about using these frequencies for healing. So perhaps you could just talk to that for a moment. What research we've got on that, and what the possibilities are.
It's already the recommended therapy by the American Medical Association for non-union. In other words, if your grandmother breaks a hip and it doesn't mend, the recommendation is that use pulse magnetic fields to help regenerate the bone. So this is an illustration that it's possible. But what I would say is that this is a very primitive illustration of what electromagnetic fields should be able to do. The future in this direction, I think, has a lot of potential. But as long as engineers tell us that it's impossible and that we shouldn't study this, as the 1997 FCC 704 tends to imply, saying that it does nothing to the environment, so consequently it's innocuous and it has no effect, then you've amputated a whole aspect of science unfairly. And I mean, in the future, people can determine whether this is criminal or not.
Because isn't there a certain hypocrisy here? If we say on one hand these pulsed magnetic fields can be used for healing, and then on the other we're saying so they do affect our health, and then on the other hand we're saying, well, no, they don't. There's only this heating effect. So isn't there something doesn't add up here?
Oh, well, there's many things that don't add up. When you have results coming out of the National Toxicology Program this year, and you have the FDA trying to minimize and attenuate the interpretation of these results are entirely obvious. I mean, it's very clear what they're saying. They're saying that the basis on which the bioactivity of electromagnetic fields has been done in the United States until now is entirely wrong. And the only reason why the FDA would do this is because it's part of the US government, which has egg on its face if it realizes that they were wrong. And so this is very troubling. But the government, the US government, is a big machine. For it to change its mind, what do you need? A Trump?
Yeah. So, on the theme of solutions, you've talked about solutions on a national level in terms of this DC power. Solutions in terms of 5G, then it's what we do. We call our senator, if you're in the US, or your local electoral, national elected official. What can we do?
The problem with 5G is that it's objectionable on so many fronts, in the sense that from the point of view of exposure to electromagnetic fields, it is clearly a bad idea. It's also a bad idea from the point of view of privacy, in the sense that the Internet of Things, which is a justification for installing 5G, is certainly a threat to information theft. In other words, the main purpose of IoT is to generate information, but it's also to gather information. And if the station that gathers this information is on a public right-of-way and is owned by somebody else, it becomes somebody else's property. So it is, I think, an encroachment of corporations on the private domain. And I don't know if the state of Texas or Massachusetts is willing to tolerate this. But this is another aspect of it that is objectionable. From the technical point of view, it's not obvious that this will work at all, because if you multiply sources without limit, you'll have to place filters in everything. So the cost will rise correspondingly as you have more applications. And do you really want your fridge to be flashing you messages about its content continuously? What applications do we really need? And so the technical solution is that since we are going to depend in the future on high data traffic, let's use the technique that is most favorable for this. Let's use optical fiber. Optical fiber is what telcos use for themselves. But when it comes to you, they want to give you something different because it generates more profits. But let's bring optical fibers to the home. And when you need mobility, use wireless as it should be. Cell phones should not be transformed into a permanent eye candy station that is glued to your face so that you no longer see the world. Cell phones should still be cell phones, a means to communicate. And the fact that 5G could download to your phone 10 movies in 2 seconds is of no value whatsoever. You don't design an aircraft carrier on a cell phone. So let's not go overboard. Industry realizes cell phones is cash cow. We're going to make this cow as bloated and as huge as we can.
Yeah, it's looking a pretty big cow at the moment. And so you understand this science very deeply. In terms of your personal recommendations on a day-to-day basis for people that are watching here today, what can you say, Dr. Paul? What recommendations can you give? Some tips here for EMF protection to live safely, in our electromagnetic world?
I think that if you have children, you should monitor your home for low frequencies. Make sure children are not near high low frequency fields. You're using computers, get rid of these Wi-Fi. routers, have a wired home, possibly buy an optical fiber to your home so that you get all the speed that you need, and resist and in fact demolish these 5G stations that will be coming in front of your home relatively soon. This is an aberration. This is the point of view of a group of people who simply want to make money in a way, and they don't understand the consequences of what they're doing, frankly. They resist, being informed about it. And so we have to resist it for whatever reason, for privacy, for exposure, for encroachment of corporations on public land. All of these reasons are good. Maybe the problem is that we don't know which one will be the most effective in changing the minds of people, but there are plenty of elements there to find that objectionable as a plan.
So DC is the way to go, long term, perhaps medium term. And in terms of data transmission, so wireless, okay, we're living in a wireless world, so you're a realist, obviously it's not going to change. You've got to accept that this wireless world and this wireless abilities and capabilities which we have are not going to change, but we don't want it to. We don't want to crank it up at another level to make this cow any fatter, to make people richer, and to give us really these technological advances. Which, honestly, who needs them? As you say, downloading 10 films in seconds or minutes. Who really needs that? And so, yeah, an important point you make there about the fiber optics. And just to clarify, the fiber optics has no electromagnetic fields, and we're transmitting data through light, which is why it's safer, is it not?
And at the current situation, fiber optics is 200 times faster than 5G. And ultimately, if you modulated light in the same way that you do 5G, it would be 10,000 times faster. So you invest in that infrastructure, it's upgradable to something, whereas with wireless, you'd have to go to 16,177 G to get there. So essentially, these Gs are dollar signs. In other words, you need to upgrade the equipment, you need to upgrade your phone, you need to upgrade everything. It's like the upgrades on software. Once you have a word processor, the number of upgrades that you need to this, for this to make it workable is very limited. But they want to continue selling, reselling, and reselling the same thing to you all the time. So the G is mostly about that. What we want is cheap, effective, dependable data transmission that can be provided by optical fiber. When you need mobility, use a cell phone for its true purpose. Communications when you're on the move.
Yeah. Fantastic information you shared with us here, Dr. Heroux. Any last comments or observations you want to make here before we close?
I wonder what the future looks like, because the decision makers in Washington don't have a lot of information on this. And of course, industry has been lobbying them for so long. They are I would say, entrenched with the political powers. The legal system possibly is a bit hesitant. I'm not sure where the solution will come from. Perhaps it will come from the grassroots. More power to you, Lloyd.
Well, without people like you, then this summit wouldn't exist. So really, it's thanks to you, because there are, so I've got quite a lot of scientists on, thankfully, who've agreed to participate, but there are some which won't. And because they're in a difficult situation, because of I'm not going to name names, obviously, because of the funding, and you've alluded to this, and so I want to thank you for your contribution over the decades to this subject, and you're still very active, perhaps more active than ever, if I'm not mistaken, looking at your CV. So thank you for these decades of work which you've done, and the work that which you're doing still. and for really, just going the extra mile on this, because you could have, you could just be sat at home in Canada and, be watering your garden or whatever now, but you're not. You're out, you're talking to me here today, and obviously you've shared this inconvenient truth, and that is, people need to know the truth. So thank you for that, and thank you for participating in the EMF Health Summit.
You're very welcome.
And for all of you who've joined us today, thank you for being part of this movement. My name is Lloyd Borrell. See you on the next session. Take care. Thank you. Bye-bye.